For the benefit of ordinary people, I believe the economy should be much more tailored to individual needs and community services. People shouldn't be struggling to pay their bills, choosing between heating their homes or eating for a week.
Starting from the taxes, like the way that they are taking taxes, I think is not fair. I think is not based on your income and how much you spend. Because, for example, in my case, I feel like they take a lot of taxes because at the end of the month, after paying rents and food and transport and all of these, I don't have enough. Like, I have enough to survive, but I don't have enough to live.
Stop rich people being in charge of the government. Yeah, stopping rich people being in charge of the government would improve our economic system. People who have actually grown up and been educated in a public system where they have experienced real world problems.
Welcome back to SystemShift. Many ordinary people feel overwhelmed by the many crises they face, including a cost of living crisis that has many of us struggling with our immediate needs. On top of this, we have the existential threats such as war, climate change and loss of biodiversity. So, many people are asking themselves, how can we reshape the economy to align with human flourishing within planetary boundaries? To take a look at how the economy should work, for the benefit of the many rather than the few, I'm joined by Amanda Janoo, an economic policy expert and a passionate advocate for transformative economic systems and sustainability. Amanda worked for the United Nations and the African Development Bank as an industrial policy and structural transformation expert. She is now economics and policy lead at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is not just working towards a different economic system, but is looking to shift how we live together so that we become caretakers and creators of a flourishing world. Amanda is known for her advocacy work for Indigenous wisdom, participatory processes, and redefining the purpose of economic structures. In this episode, Amanda takes us on a journey through the Wellbeing Economy movement, challenging the conventional emphasis on growth and the maximisation of wealth. She reframes the economy as a tool to serve society and the planet and underscores the need to integrate social and ecological well-being into decision-making processes. Join us on this enlightening journey to a more holistic and thriving economic future, a future that champions human prosperity while safeguarding the environment for generations to come. So, without further ado, very welcome, Amanda Janoo.
Oh, thank you so much. So great to be here, Carl.
It's really nice to have you here, and let's hope we can spread the well-being of the well-being economy to our listeners today.
Oh, absolutely.
So, what is well-being economy for you?
A well-being economy is an economy that supports the thriving and well-being of all life. And I think to begin with, whenever we want to talk about the economy, I think it's important to ask what is the economy, first of all. And the way that I like to describe it is as the way that we produce and provide for one another. It's just the system and interaction between people and our natural environment and the ways in which we improve our collective quality of life. And so ultimately, its success should be evaluated by whether or not we are thriving as a society and as an ecosystem. But the reality is that for quite a long time, we viewed the purpose of the economy as purely to grow itself, as purely to create profit and wealth maximization, with the belief that that was ultimately what was going to be most important for our happiness or our well-being. And I think what we've been seeing and we're now really reconciling with is that it's not leading to the expected improvements in our well-being. In many ways, it's leaving us worse off, obviously, with the climate crisis, inequality crisis, cost of living, mental health crisis, and many others. And so the well-being economy movement has really emerged, and it comes under so many different banners that you've been exploring within this podcast of post-growth, degrowth, solidarity economy, economy for the common good, and many others. But at its heart is this recognition that we have to stop treating people and planet like they're here to serve the economy and start treating the economy like it's here to serve us.
how come we have an economy that is actually not designed to serve us and the planet?
Well, and I think this first point is to be very clear on what really matters for well-being. And so this process is going on within a lot of communities and countries around the world who are starting from a different North Star, a centering of social and ecological well-being, and really clarifying the things that they feel are most important for their societies and ecosystems now and for generations to come. And so by clarifying within the Wellbeing Economy movement, we speak about 5 needs, for example, but there's many other kind of frameworks that you can find within the Wellbeing Economy governments, for example, and others I can speak to more. But if we even see, I would say that this podcast is part of the Wellbeing Economy movement in the sense that if we are starting from a point of saying, how would we design and evaluate our economy by its capacity to ensure that everybody has the necessary foundations to live a life of dignity and purpose?
You showed to me a really interesting contrast in one of your speeches I listened to, and that was what happens when the traditional well-being focus in the economy clashes with the current economy, and that was in Mozambique regarding work ethics. I would love you to tell that story again.
Absolutely. I was working in Mozambique and they were talking about how the issue was that cultural change takes time, right? And that they would need time for their culture to change in order to achieve the level of development that we have achieved in the United States or Europe. And they gave the example of how foreign investors would come in and set up production or factories or different businesses, and people would come to work for a couple of days, maybe a week, and then would go back to their families and communities and wouldn't return for weeks, sometimes months, until they needed more money. And in their mind, they lacked a work ethic. And what I realized in that moment was that they had a concept of enough, a culture that understood how much was enough. And I realized that in the United States, we don't have any notion of enough. There can never be enough because it conflicts with this cultural sort of idea of ambition and progress and success. And so in that moment, it really made me realize there was a lot more that I had to learn than I could teach about achieving true sustainable development or a good life in line and in harmony with our natural world.
That's interesting. I mean, WHO recently said that depression is the main cause of disability today. And this culture of never feeling sufficiency, never having enough, couldn't that be part of it? Like, you always have to chase the next goalpost, never reflect on what you have and how you live and what you appreciate. Could that be part of the problem in that culture?
Oh, absolutely. And this is something for me, having worked in international development for a long time, now coming back and living in the United States again, that I have probably felt most heavily is the level of anxiety and depression here. And I think one of the challenges is that the emphasis and the culture of individualism means that everybody feels like it's their fault, that they have to eat better or work harder, meditate more, do whatever to try to find that happiness. But if everybody is feeling this, then clearly there's something larger and systemic going on. But because we can't see that, I think it creates this burden and it makes it very hard on ourselves and so therefore very hard on others as well. And it creates and perpetuates a lot of social isolation, disconnection, mistrust, and obviously, as you say, mental health challenges as well.
In the first season, we talked about the financial system, the money generation system, and other problematic aspects of today's economy. But this podcast is also about finding solutions and way forward. And there is actually something we can spread regarding well-being economy. So let's say that our listeners now know already that we have a problem with the current economic system, and they maybe even feel it themselves, that it's actually not really to the benefit of me, my neighborhood, my community, my country, nature around me. None of these are actually benefiting in the proper way from the current system. So what would be the steps and the definitions of a better economy? How could we focus more on well-being? Let's take this step by step. So a well-being economy, what do you hope for that to deliver?
So if we take it step by step, then the first step is to really be clear on what matters for well-being. And so across countries, many of them are now developing alternative national performance frameworks to GDP, for example. And it all starts with that question. So in Wales, for example, they asked, what kind of Wales do you want to leave for your children and grandchildren? As a way of really identifying what are our longer term well-being goals? What is our North Star by which we want to orient ourselves? And there are some commonalities, I would say, around health and time, social connection, trust, clean air, clean water, a restored and thriving ecosystem. And then each one also has different sort of framings depending on, our global responsibility or meaning and purpose, these sort of aspects. And to be clear that that's what really matters for a good life. And I think everybody can connect with this because whenever I've asked somebody, what do you love about where you live? People always talk about their communities or the natural environment around them. And then when you ask, okay, so then why aren't those the things that we're really prioritizing most in our decision making? It starts to unlock and to make people realize that, oh yeah, okay, why isn't that ultimately then our metrics and our focus of success? And so it's about the downgrading of the economy. Now, we've held it as supreme for so long that even as we develop, let's say, these national performance frameworks that emphasize the importance of health, we still feel the need to make the case for why health is good for the economy, rather than feeling like we can swap that burden of proof and ask, how would we evaluate the economy in terms of its contribution to our health? And so what the Wellbeing Economy movement is doing is to illustrate all of the different initiatives, concepts, theories that we would say maybe we're in the new economy space, but that are showing how we can build a more equitable economic system, not just through redistribution of funds by the government, but through employee-owned or cooperatives, of how we can protect and regenerate our environment, not just through mitigating or adapting to climate change, but really fostering regenerative production processes and circular economy processes, and how we can ensure that people really have a voice in these processes by relocalizing and embedding economies so that people have the capacity to mold and direct that system of production and provision in line with their histories and geographies, cultures, and values. And so I think what you are doing in this podcast, for example, we've heard from so many different amazing geniuses in this space around a wide range of different ideas on how to achieve this, and examples of where we're seeing experimentations like universal basic income, community wealth building, regenerative agriculture, and many, many more that we see as all pieces of this alternative economic system and paradigm that is designed to foster social and ecological well-being.
And when you come to Graeber's research on bullshit jobs, that you actually have a life satisfaction in what you spend a lot of your time doing. And then all this, what you mentioned here, in the beginning of your answer, you start to talk about nature, health, well-being, community. This is never part of a standard economic calculus. It's just side effects at most. So when you talk about well-being economy, you normally have 5 or 6 pillars that you describe it to. One of them is, for example, nature. Let's start with that one. How would a well-being economy be in relationship to nature? How would you integrate nature's needs into the economy?
Let me start by saying one of the things that we've helped in starting as the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is the Wellbeing Economy Governments. And that is currently comprised of Canada, New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Scotland, and Wales. And they've all developed alternative national performance frameworks to GDP. And in Canada, for example, they have 12 domains. And one of them, and this is work related to the point around bullshit jobs, is around meaning and purpose. And so the reason why I think this is significant is because, as you said, David Graeber, what he found is that in countries like mine, the majority of people believe that they now have a job that need not or should not exist. Yeah, a job that is contributing nothing to the world or actively making it worse off. And if that is not a sign of a broken economic system, I do not know what is, right? But at the same time, you have in the United States, for example, 9 out of 10 people saying that they would actually take a lower salary in order to have more meaning in their work. And that's a lot of the ways in which we've sort of designed our economic system now, where the question that I hear most from young people is, how can I do good and do well? Because it feels like you get one or the other. Because we've designed a system where there seems to be a almost perfect inverse relationship between how much you earn and how much you're contributing to society, with the most exploitive and damaging and destructive industries garnering billions, whereas the kind of work or effort or activities that hold this world together, that are centered in care or stewardship or regeneration, seem to be paid next to nothing, or sometimes nothing at all. And the point here is that that is not inevitable. That is a product of our design of our current system. Because for a long time, if our goal was GDP growth rate to just produce more, then we were always focusing on encouraging the big corporations, entrepreneurs, investment firms that we saw as most efficient at generating the profits and wealth that were going to stimulate growth. But once you center social and ecological well-being, then the type of economic activities or work that you see as most valuable is ultimately going to change. And so the space and the value that will be put on work done for regeneration, for rewilding, for stewardship, the work which is done for care and connection and the reproduction, right, of society in some way in terms of social services, etc., starts to come in view as the kind of work we really want to value and encourage and reward. And it also shines a light for us as well on what are the kinds of activities that are actually damaging to our current well-being. And I think that's the other flip side of it as well, because there are a lot of jobs that people themselves realize are actually quite damaging. And the point is that we need to also think about how do we hospice and phase out those kind of activities so that we have the energy, resources, and creative skills, right, to put our time towards those more regenerative and collectively oriented sort of areas of work. And so when we start with that different entry point, I think it shines a light on different kind of work and can ultimately ensure that we build an economy where we're valuing economic activities and behaviors by their contribution to those social and ecological goals.
And how would that actually work then? How can we upgrade things that are useful for humanity and downgrade things that are destructive for humanity and our planet and equality?
Wales is one of my favorite examples from a national level kind of government initiative where Wales, on the basis of the citizen engagement I mentioned, developed these 7 high-level well-being goals. But what was even more significant is they passed a legislation which required different ways of working, a different governance system in order to achieve those goals. And so they recognized they needed longer term thinking, right? So to set goals that were 25 years, so for the next generation, that they needed to embrace a preventative mindset. So to not just have the government just constantly there to put out fires, but actually to move upstream and prevent those crises from happening in the first place. And that there needed to be an integration of and greater collaboration across government. So every government agency was collectively responsible for all 7 goals. So the health ministry was not just responsible for achieving health, but needed to consider all 7 of the goals in terms of biodiversity, in terms of global responsibility, in terms of equity, etc., when they were designing those goals. And one of the ways that this ended up manifesting was the creation of a Future Generations Commissioner, whose job was to represent the interests of those who have yet to be born and to oversee this system of governance reform. And at one point, the Welsh government wanted to build a big new highway that was going to go through a natural reserve. And they
As always. There's never, ever any other place to build them, apparently.
Yeah, exactly. And they had to make the case for how it would contribute to all 7 well-being goals. And they couldn't make the case for contributing to any of them except for maybe one. And so as a result, they ended up putting a freeze on any new infrastructure development for the next, I think it was maybe 3 or 5 years, so that all of that money would go through to active travel and public transportation instead, that they could make the case for contributing to a wide range of well-being goals. And
that's actually really interesting, because Maine did a similar thing regarding external shopping centers. They needed to show that they were net beneficial to the local economy. But of course, if you have an external shopping center, you always have the same chains there, and all the money disappears from the community. And after they introduced this law, it was impossible to show that they were actually benefiting the local economy. So like bringing in this more holistic analysis of what you're investing in is probably a really important step.
Absolutely. And I think this is what we're seeing at this moment. And what I think this podcast also is an illustration of is a paradigm shift where we're moving from very linear, mechanistic, siloed, hierarchical ways of thinking and organizing processes towards more holistic, systemic, compassionate, I would say, forms. But the challenge is that a lot of times the tools and also the institutions that we have are not fit for purpose. But what we're seeing is that more and more governments, what they are realizing is that even the richest governments in the world realize that with the increasing severity and frequency of the crises we're facing, they just don't have the resources to keep growing the economy so that they can take some of that wealth to fix the damages that were done to people and planet in the process, and really have to start getting the economy to do more of the heavy lifting in terms of ensuring that they are producing the things that are most essential for people's well-being, providing them in a ways that ensures that security, but also ensuring production processes that are actually going to be respectful of our natural environment and regenerating.
And why isn't the current model of just letting everybody buy what they want and see how the market solves it good?
Well, I think that probably the major issue of what you've seen is that so much of the past, let's say, 30, 40 years has been based on this assumption that if you just take this hands-off approach and allow for big private enterprise to lead this process and for individuals to assert their power purely as consumers, that ultimately it would be fine because all of this wealth would trickle down, that even if our wages weren't increasing, things were cheaper, so you didn't really have to worry about it. And from a societal point of view, we've now hit this tipping point where people now realize that, one, they don't just want to be consumers, they do want work that has meaning and purpose and that they feel like is genuinely contributing something to others, that the cost of things is actually not cheap anymore. And so that argument is failing in terms of our basic needs of food, energy, housing really becoming out of control. And then you put on top of it the climate crisis, and it's very clear that the system is failing, right? Like if the system is not delivering on what it had promised in terms of forever improving our collective sort of quality of life, and that is really only working for a very small segment of our global population.
Already in the first season of this podcast, we conclude that trickle-down theory is actually really flooding up theory. But yeah, one thing you mentioned here when Wales designed this was participation, empowerment, and influence by everyone. I think this is a really important part of any change, because if you feel empowered, you're more engaged in changing stuff and spending your time in helping your community change things. So what kind of experiences do you have with empowerment and local involvement?
So the topic of participation is probably the area that I'm most passionate about, because I do think that one of the greatest consequences of the form of corporate globalization that we have encouraged over the last decades has been that people no longer feel like they have any voice or power over their livelihoods, that they are subject to the whims of the market or of forces that are so beyond their control. And so one of the things I always want to remind people is that the discourse that dominates economics and the economy really feeds into this, because whenever we talk about the economy, we hear GDP growth rates or stock market values, something about mergers and acquisitions, etc. And it tends to make the economy feel like something that's out there beyond our control. And I want to just remind everyone that we are the economy. Yeah, like we have the power to change it. Again, it's the way we produce and provide for one another. And what we're seeing in our modern era, in line with, I would say, our renaissance and sort of new economic thinking, is also a renaissance in participatory democracy. And so the OECD, for example, did a research paper which was looking at participatory democratic experiments since the 1950s. And just the past few years, it's been exponential. It's been all over the world at different kinds of levels. And this is because the need for political sort of reform is the flip side of also the need for economic reform. because we've concentrated so much wealth and power into the hands of fewer and fewer institutions, entities, and individuals, that in order for us to meaningfully create this transformation, we also need to then redistribute power back to people in order to make those types of policies that they feel are aligned. And I think one of the challenges nowadays is that we're seeing people can go both ways, right? The voicelessness can also feed fascism, right? A desire for looking inward and protecting our own communities and trying to shove everybody back out. And so some of the examples that I think are most powerful come from, let's say, for example, I would say for your audience in particular, the Greenpeace audience. So Spain recently held a citizens' assembly on climate. And so what they did was they chose 100 randomly selected citizens to really go through a process of identifying what were the core policy priorities in order to deal with the climate crisis. And what was amazing, so again, with this point of once you start with the environment, with the natural world, what was clear was that so many of these recommendations were fundamentally about economic systems change. They proposed circular economy reforms, regenerative agriculture, green infrastructure, proposals around aligning human health and ecological restorations. And all of these proposals, because it was instigated by the government, were then sent directly to Parliament and to the Prime Minister's office for deliberation and consideration. And so when we see people being given the voice and the power to really think about what kind of reforms are necessary for the social and environmental crises or priorities of our time, they naturally and just intuitively understand the kind of areas of the economy that need to be changed.
That's interesting. You had almost exactly the same results when Macron made the same thing in France.
Mm-hmm.
And however, those policy recommendations in the end, the government didn't really implement them. But that is another example of when people are given the full picture and you can see the consequences of what you recommend, people generally tend to recommend sensible stuff.
Absolutely. There's another good example, which has been kind of beautiful, again, with this future orientation I recently learned about in Japan, where they've been hosting these participatory processes with young people. And it's based on some sort of tradition that they had already. But what they have is the young people first consider the kind of strategies that are needed for the current society. And then they have them put on different robes and dress differently and consider what kind of strategies or priorities are needed for a society in 60 years. And what they realize is when you consider the society in 60 years, the kinds of proposals are a lot more transformative and a lot more bold and ambitious. And so I think that's also the point of the importance of moving beyond just problem solution to also really thinking about a future orientation and also a positive orientation of where we want to go. Because that, I think, also unlocks our imaginations a lot in terms of moving from a fight or flight and anxiety response to just dealing with the crises to really saying, this is the world we want to create. And this is where we see already the parts that are in our communities and in our world that we can build upon to get there.
Yeah, I recognize this way of thinking from some North American indigenous populations where they have a similar logic of before they consider making a decision, they check like what happened 3 generations ago and 3 generations ahead and how does it impact these. I think that's kind of a more long-term thinking is crucial in finding the right policies.
Yeah, the 7th generation thinking. And that's something I really want to emphasize as well, is that the wellbeing economy movement, I would say that it's probably its strongest and it's accelerating most quickly in high-income countries because we are in a state of existential crisis in the sense that we've built these systems that are really good at generating wealth, but everybody's miserable and our planet is on fire. And so we're starting to question what's the point of life. But ultimately, this idea is not new. It is not our own. It heralds from Indigenous and alternative development philosophies like Ubuntu, Swaraj, Buen Vivir, that are really centered in understanding that to live a good life is to live in harmony and balance with others, oneself, and the natural world. And so a lot of what I'm seeing a great amount of inspiration is in the decolonization movement, because this is not just about rebalancing historical injustices and power relations, but also empowering different paradigms and systems that we have marginalized for so long because they didn't align with the modernity narrative that we've held. And to see that there is incredible wisdom in the ways that so many, the majority world, are functioning in terms of their cultural and systems that can ultimately be the blueprints for the better world we envision.
Yeah, if listeners want to learn more about imperialism and colonialism, we have a really interesting episode with Koja Koram from season 1. So I can highly recommend that one. Okay, so let's say we started with nature, we went through participation. What other aspects characterizes a well-being economy?
So I would say the third aspect that we talk a lot about is fairness. And so the idea of really holding justice at the heart of the economic system so that we are ensuring a just distribution of not just income, but of time, of voice, and of power within our economic system. And so I know that you had Wilkinson and Pickett, I think, really speaking so beautifully of the consequences of inequality. And so again, part of this, of course, is the need to ensure more redistribution. But for us, it's also about where you're supporting more economic democracy within firms themselves, within building a really diversified and locally embedded communities that are multiplying wealth and ensuring that we're fulfilling the needs of one another in a way that's not going to be so insecure. And I would say the other aspect as well is around connection, right? So this deep need that we have to be connected to one another and to be in right relationship with others in our society and with our natural world. And this is one where I think there's a lot that we can find inspiration from within the care economy and the core economy, which recognizes and breaks down the sort of duality of the state and the market. So it's not just about more government or more business, but also of recognizing how the incredible value that comes in non-monetary systems of provision and care. And so how do we protect and really value those as well? The ways that we provide for one another as families and neighbors and communities, because that's really the magic. I read a paper quite a long time ago, which showed that when we engage in a gift exchange, right? Like we give somebody a gift, it reduces our stress levels and boosts our immune system, and it reinforces social trust. Whereas when we engage in a market transaction, seemingly, as benign as just going and buying something at a store, it does the opposite. It actually increases our stress levels, reduces our immune systems, and reinforces social distrust. And that's a lot of what the new research in neuroscience is showing, is that we're really hardwired to want to give. That's a big part of our economic system. And it also then comes back to, I think, one of our earlier points, which is around from a purely personal perspective. The one thing that we know, and that has been illustrated from spiritual scholars, I think, throughout time, is that the two qualities that are most highly correlated with happiness are generosity and contentment. And our current economic system, it does not encourage us to be either of those things. We should never be content, and we should try to just hoard as much as we can for ourselves. And so finding, just these small spaces where we see the ways in which we do hold regard for the people in our lives and our communities who are generous, that we see the wisdom, right, in people around us who have contentment, and being able to hold and to recognize that as much as we emphasize competitiveness and selfishness and might be encouraging or rewarding those behaviors, there are still very strong social systems and wisdom that recognizes the power of the other motivations as well.
But unfortunately, psychopaths are more common in the top level CEOs than in the general population, and really wealthy people think they deserve it. So going for the redistribution agenda was possible. It was possible after the Second World War, when everybody came home, sacrificed their life for the country, and they said, I want a fair share of the economy now. And you had this incredibly high marginal tax rates of 80, 90, even 99% in some countries. But what about trying a pre-distribution schedule and pre-distribution mechanics where you actually don't create the inequality from the beginning? And we already talked about the financial system and changing that in other episodes. But what other methods of pre-distribution could you have so you actually don't create the conflict from the outset?
Mm-hmm. How do we move upstream and build an economic system that itself is really designed to ensure more equitable outcomes? And so part of that is around different types of enterprise structures, which are more democratically owned. And so you're ensuring a just distribution of the wealth and the income, either through employee ownership or cooperatives, or an increasing amount of not-for-profit companies that are emerging as well, that are utilizing any of their profits to actually go back directly into social or collective sort of aims. I think there's also the revitalization of the commons, of community-owned governance systems and processes, and of, really ensuring also, I think, universal basic services in certain areas. And so I think that with the current cost of living crisis, it's hitting us so hard because it's in many of the areas that are the most important for our lives, like food or for housing. And so in the United States, for example, the cost of living crisis is actually largely being driven by increases in the cost of housing. It accounts for about 40% of our consumer price index. And this rising cost of housing, I don't know if anybody's ever experienced housing insecurity, but when you don't know where you're going to be living, or you're not sure if you're going to be able to pay your rent or your mortgage, it is totally consuming. Yeah, it takes over your entire nervous system to not be clear about ensuring that basic need is there. And we do have a universal guarantee to water. Yeah, and there's no reason why there shouldn't be a universal guarantee to housing and to food and to the basic sort of goods and services that we need within our society, so that we don't have to feel that insecurity. And that is provided as a right of every individual, regardless of their income and status. But housing is one that we don't want to talk about, because I'm sure, as others will be speaking to, that's a huge part of the speculative financial revolution that we've allowed for. It's a big part of the rentier economy. So the ways in which we've legitimized people not making more money off of their wages is to say, we've built this system where you make money off of money. So the rentier economy is pretty much where you are making money off of charging somebody to use something that they need, as opposed to really producing or providing something of genuine value to others. And so I think obviously everybody would understand this in the sense of rent, right? If you have a landlord, the rent that they get from you is purely just because they own the building and they had that asset to begin with. But the problem is that we've created a huge system that actually provides way more benefits to the owners of that asset relative to the users of,
And then you can turbocharge this using tax havens and holding companies in order to extract even more wealth from people.
Absolutely. And so the other night I was reading John Kenneth Galbraith's The Great Crash, because there's this term in the US right now that's coming about around how we're in a silent depression. And it was shocking to see that the major factors he saw as underpinning the Great Depression were very similar to the ones that we are in today, in terms of really high levels of inequality, lower wage increases relative to profit increases. And so because you had a smaller group of people really holding all that wealth, one, it creates instability, because if anything changes in their behaviors, it ripples across a much larger area. But also when that level of wealth is controlled by a small number of people, there's only so many things they're going to buy before they put it in the stock market. And when there's more money in the market, they're going to start lending it out. And it's going to end up creating one, like a sort of debt crisis, but also what he called the pyramiding of companies, where they were increasingly owned by fewer and fewer investment firms. And it's like, this whole situation is really the same thing once again. We're repeating a similar phenomena. And the nice thing, I guess, is that we can learn from history in this regard. But also, we have the additional climate crisis. So the kind of strategies and solutions that we need to be focused on are different, because the other part of this is, let's say we have the food crisis, then we need to really focus on how do we ensure food security for all people, but also the production of it in a regenerative manner. So how do we really encourage and reward regenerative agricultural practices so that it becomes, let's say, the new organic food in some way, and protect the regenerative production practices that are already existing in many areas of the world currently that have yet to have transitioned to really large, like industrial production. Or with energy, the increasing energy prices is because of profiteering and a huge concentration and control by a few industries. And we know that we need an energy transition, right? So how do we leverage upon this moment to really build the political will and the public demand for new systems of energy provision and security, not just now, for generations to come?
Well, at least you convinced me, because I don't want another second depression, Great Depression, and then World War, and then aggravating that with biodiversity collapse and climate crisis. It doesn't seem like a wonderful future. So let's say we try to look for other solutions. Mm-hmm. And going further in the well-being economy, so we talked about fairness, nature, and participation. What would be the next pillar?
Dignity, yeah. So the 5 needs we talk about are dignity, fairness, participation, nature, and purpose, right? And so dignity is what we've been talking about already as well, which is how do we really build an economy that ensures everybody has the foundations needed for a life of dignity and purpose. And that actually was one of the original definitions of political economy. Yep. So around the time that Adam Smith was writing, there was also this guy, Sir James Stewart, who defined the purpose of economics, or at that time that was termed political economy, as figuring out a way by which to inspire the natural reciprocal relations in society so that people would provide for one another's wants and needs in a way that did not threaten poverty or insecurity for that population. So our economy should be designed and evaluated by its ability to ensure that everybody has what they need in a way that is not threatened or volatile and that might, push them into poverty.
Yeah, that's a good case for basic income, I would say also, because if it's unconditional, then you have dignity. You have the trust to spend this money in a wise way. And it doesn't matter when we tried basic income schemes in Namibia or India or Finland or other countries, we always see the same. People are much more responsible than what economists think they are, than what politicians think they are.
Absolutely. And then that brings us back to the point around participation, right? Because there is a paternalism, which often, I think, undermines really progressive agendas because we believe that we know better than others. And one of the experiments that we all did, which I really love, was in a community in Scotland, which is sort of a historically more marginalized economically community. And in Scotland, they recently have a whole thing around children's human rights. And so we went through a process of asking children what they really felt mattered for the well-being of the community, so that would be a foundation for developing a well-being economy strategy and new systems of sort of accountability within the city council and within the local government. And the children, they got it. Yeah, they're natural systems thinkers. People were like, oh, they're just going to want sweets or something. No, they realized that the major things that were important for their community was closer access to the goods and services they needed. Yeah, so they didn't have to travel so far to get things. That there was a need for more social connection and trust within the community, and that there was a need for more play and time for adults and children together. And the thing that they ended up proposing as one of the immediate short-term steps was a Christmas festival and market, because they felt like that would support local businesses. It would provide a space for people to connect with one another and to spend time joyously, right? And that was what was really important, because there was a lot of crime and drug use and, insecurity. and things of that community. And what a beautiful illustration to combat that paternalism. Because if children get it, like people get it, they understand what is really needed.
It comes natural to us. I mean, one of the better definitions of intelligence I heard was that how much time you're able to set aside to play and leisure. We still need to have a purpose. The last point here. So how is that defined? What's the purpose of having purpose in here?
Well, and that's really around this beyond GDP, I would say, or post-growth or degrowth. How do we move beyond the economic ascendancy or prioritization to really the centering of social and ecological well-being as the purpose of the economy? And that's whereby then we can begin to design and evaluate our economy's success accordingly, and to really identify the economic activities and behaviors that we see as positively or negatively contributing to our collective well-being. We're pretty much redefining value in many ways so that we are able to see and celebrate the types of areas of the economy that are positively contributing well-being while discouraging the others. And I think that actually COVID was a really good example in this regard, because around the world, it did not take policymakers very long to identify which sectors or workers they viewed as most essential. And
you mean investment bankers?
Exactly, right? Yeah, it was not the hedge fund managers, right?
What?
Yeah. It was farmers and like
healthcare workers
and healthcare workers and delivery drivers. And
what a shock to society to discover this. Yeah,
absolutely. And that was only thinking about how do we just in this very moment maintain social well-being, right? And so we need to expand that to the environment as well. But the point is that we logically know, and that I think we're also seeing that process of identification of essential workers, it's leading to another big upswing, I think, in the labor movement, but also the quiet quitting, this sort of reflection on what kind of work really matters and where we want to put our energies, how we want to contribute to the betterment of society. And so, yes, to your point around dignity, I think part of that is UBI. So really transforming and getting rid of this whole idea of a labor market, which is honestly pretty gross. The idea that we have a market for people, that's fundamentally it's like a false commodification of us, of the ownership of our time, of our energy, to saying we are going to ensure that everybody has the basic security that is needed through a universal basic income or universal basic services, so that then the kind of work that we want to then encourage and reward is in the provision of those sort of basic services and goods, or in the kind of creative, intrinsically motivated activities that people want to pursue. I think we're starting to see as well is transformation in accounting systems and the ways in which values are redefining value. And so there's a great article, which is by the Prime Minister of Iceland, talking about that gender mainstreaming experience and the ways in which, through a process of having similar, it sounds like to your government's reflections on recognizing that the tendency to view physical infrastructure like roads and bridges, etc., as an investment, and social infrastructure, which is health, education, as an expenditure, was inherently gendered because men have traditionally worked in physical infrastructure and women have worked in social infrastructure. And so they redefined those codes to say that social infrastructure is investment as well. And so that allowed them to pass much more progressive policies that would have otherwise been viewed as too expensive. And another one of my favorite examples is from a community in Costa Rica where they gave citizenship to all their pollinators, sort of the bees and the butterflies, etc. And as a result, then had to redefine infrastructure so that it was no longer just a road or a building, it was also the green space. The green space was infrastructure. And so it completely revolutionized their urban planning on that basis. And so I think our minds can be sometimes limited of what is possible once we open ourselves up to really consider ethically what is important.
That reminds me of the German village of Grafenachau that said that pollination services is a key societal function that the municipality must make sure it happens. So let's say you manage to convince people that these aspects of a well-being economy is something to strive for. And people self-evidently understand that the current economic system is actually not working for them or the planet. How would you motivate someone to take the first step? What would be the first natural steps to take if you want to participate in this process?
It might be helpful to also share a little bit about this is what the Wellbeing Economy Alliance was really developed to try to help with, because it's not about just finding the perfect alternative economic model or theory that can be transplanted onto this one, because it's really about starting from that recognition that we are the economy. It's a system that we design, that we are a part of every day, but that also is constantly transforming, and that we have the power to redesign in line with different goals and objectives. And so the point here is, yes, we need to amplify the incredible new economic ideas and theories, to amplify and showcase the incredible examples of transformation we're seeing within business and in environmental spaces and in, policy. But at the end of the day, what we ultimately need is a movement. And we have people who come from all different walks of life. So many come from the environmental movement because they're frustrated with feeling like they're constantly just combating symptoms and not able to sort of move upstream and look at the system. Or people working in mental health, or working in gender equity, racial justice, in business and finance, in academia and government, and many more. But the point is mostly that the coming together and the being able to see and imagine that a different system is not only possible, but already underway, to believe that that is happening, and to see the ways in which we can collectively use our power and our voice to push for that transformation is what is going to be ultimately needed. And to find the different avenues by which I can, in my roles as friend, a community member, a business owner, as an expert in my space, whatever it might be, to start to challenge some of the dominant logic and to try to find more allies, right? We're seeing changes at the community level around recognizing that we don't want to have just a few big box chain stores to be all of our high streets, but we really want to support more diversified and local economies. We're seeing community wealth building initiatives and people joining more labor unions. There's so many different avenues that this, I would say, resistance or movement is starting to manifest. But more than anything, if I could leave people, is, just remember that you're the economy and that you have the power and the right to have an opinion about it and to engage in these discussions and be part of that transformation.
Thank you. I really agree there. You don't need to be an expert in everything, having a pre-planned utopia and so on. Just need to take the first steps with people that you want to take the first steps with, and you will move ahead. And this saying about Henry David Thoreau, like, what you get by achieving your goals is not as important as what you become by achieving your goals. So just start moving, and you will learn so much and grow in the process.
Absolutely. My favorite quote is, the process we use to get to the future is the future we get.
Well, thanks so much, Amanda, and it was really nice to have you here as our guest today.
Thank you so much, Carl. It's an absolute honor, and really appreciate you having me.